Welcome to the Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, a program dedicated to uncovering the unified nature of reality and humanity's ever-evolving place as truly galactic beings. For more information on the Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit us online at www.thescienceofmagic.net.
Hello, and thank you so much for joining us on the Science of Magic, coming to you through the X-Zone Broadcast Network, www.xzbn.net. We can also be found on www.thescienceofmagic.net. I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. This hour we'll be exploring the Echoing Chronicle. Traditionally, one of the many functions of a shaman was to treat what's known as spiritual illness. Spiritual illness has many faces and is viewed in many ways. It's treated with numerous approaches based upon the traditions of the culture and methods passed down through the lineage of the shaman. One universal spiritual illness has come to be known as soul loss. Personally, I'm not fond of the term as it indicates one's misplaced part of their eternal soul. I view it as a disconnection from our natural range of frequency, choices, or expressions at the quantum level. The frequency's still there. We've simply lost our ability to access it. This is usually the result of trauma. Something did not go well for us, so we consciously or unconsciously choose to not repeat the behavior that we are led to believe caused the unfortunate event. We rewrite our view of reality to accommodate the reframed information and go on with our lives with a little less flexibility and fewer options. The sad part is that through this disconnection, we actually also lose our ability to avoid repeating the experience. Another common occurrence is others writing our stories for us. There are family line stories that are imprinted on us early in life. For example, I had a client who every time she would be given a gift, her mother would wait until everyone was gone before beating her, taking it away, and destroying it in front of her. Then the mother would rewrite history, telling the family that my client had broken her own gift, was destructive, unappreciative, and didn't deserve nice things. Now, to be fair, it was probably a story imposed on the mother when she was young, but my client, being a small child, had no choice but to take on her mother's story as her own. She grew up with no memory of the beatings, but firmly believed she didn't deserve nice things. Should she chance to acquire something nice, it would immediately be destroyed in front of her. Her new car would be backed into in the parking lot while she looked on, unable to prevent it. Her date would spill red wine on her new white dress, and so on. Why? Her unconscious intent had programmed her energy field at the quantum level to draw in the destruction of her things in order to avoid the beatings she had forgotten. This was explained away by the story she still unwittingly lived by. She did not deserve nice things, so of course they would be destroyed. Thus the chronicle echoed through her life until she came to me for shamanic healing. While shamanic healing works at the quantum or spiritual level, it must be integrated into the other three levels, mental, emotional, and physical, before lasting change can take place. By performing shamanic healing, I can reconnect the person to the lost frequency. But for true healing to occur, I must also help them integrate the adjustment, mentally, emotionally, and physically. Until the client accesses and re-examines their stories, face and process how they feel about what happened to them, and decide on a new story to live by, there can be no lasting change. Our indigenous cultures fully utilize the power of story in their healing and teaching practices. Yet in modern society, accessing and rewriting our personal family line narratives is a lost art, a form few understand and fewer achieve. This leaves us unable to freely create what we want, as we're reduced to living our lives based on the forever echoing chronicles of our past experiences. Fortunately, narrative art is being rediscovered and brought forth in a form that can be easily employed by our modern-day culture. With us this hour is the co-author of such a work, Barbara Mainguy, M.A. Barbara is a psychotherapist and education director for the Coyote Institute for Studies of Change and Transformation. Together with Dr. Luis Mel Madrona, she has co-authored Remapping Your Mind, the Neuroscience of Self-Transformation Through Story. With this book are valuable concepts that enable the individual to understand how their personal stories drive their experience. I'll be introducing Barbara and this amazing work after this short break. You're listening to The Science of Magic. This and other episodes can always be found on our website, www.thescienceofmagic.net. The scientist and the mystic have been on an age-old, relentless search with one thing in common. They seek truth. Their paths converge in the 40,000-year-old practice of shamanism, an ancient science delving to the quantum level of life, facilitating healing, manifestation, and evolution. I'm Gwilda Wiyaka, the founder and director of Path Home Shamanic Arts School, a unique Colorado State certified occupational school training shamanic practitioners and teachers. We also provide classes for empowering personal lives through shamanism. Our certification classes are in week-long segments enabling international participation, and online classes and long-distance shamanic healing sessions are available. Come discover the science of magic in the limitless world of shamanism. www.findyourpathhome.com. Welcome back. This is The Science of Magic, dedicated to unification and evolution of consciousness. I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. Our guest this hour is Barbara Mainguy, co-author of Remapping Your Mind, the Neuroscience of Self-Transformation Through Story. Barbara, thank you so much for joining us on The Science of Magic. Hey, let's start out with, this might seem like a simple question, but what exactly is a story?
A story is a unit of meaning making. So, as human beings, we like above all to feel safe. And I often think of it as safer because I don't think there is such a thing as safe completely in life, but we could feel safer. And the way we feel safe is by understanding how the world works and feeling that we can work in the world, that we can do things that result in predictable outcomes. And when our predictable outcome does not happen, we find out that we don't have a useful explanation for the world, and we have to find a new explanation. So a story is a map of meaning of the world as we know it that describes how things work in a way that is successful. And when that story doesn't work anymore, that's when we go on a journey to find a new story.
Do we automatically go on that journey, Barbara, or is this something that we have to learn to do?
I think it depends. As I'm sure you've known through your work, some people take readily to the journey, but what happens is when we stop feeling safe, and when we don't know what's going to happen next, and that can happen if we go into a new environment, if something new happens, if we have a loss, if we have a trauma. When we stop feeling safe, we can do one of two things. We can say, okay, I don't know what's happening next, and I need to figure this out, so I need to probably open myself up to some new information to come in. I might need to leave my comfort zone to find that new information. and find a way to integrate it into my world so that I'm better prepared for next time. Or we can do what perhaps is more common and something that is really deeply human, which is to find ourselves feeling intense anxiety, because anxiety is just anxiety is defined as the feeling we have when things change. We can find ourselves experiencing anxiety, and we can go into all our patterns of avoidance. We can put our head under the covers. We can dive into substances. We can do anything. We can watch television 24 hours a day. We can do something to avoid that feeling and avoid having to take that first step into the unknown. So I think part of what we do, and I suspect what you do, is we help people to take those steps away from that story that stopped working and towards a new story, which means going on a journey, which means going on a journey that is itself a story. It's a story of discovery, a story of learning something new, and it's useful to think of that as the journey that is described in many myths, as Joseph Campbell might have thought.
So the first step towards stepping out of an old story that doesn't work is probably fairly traumatic, because you're having to step out of the familiar. Is that the way you see it?
Absolutely. You're stepping out of a thing you're stepping out of something that has been a successful working map of the world. So I've got a car. I know I can get into it. I turn the key. The engine starts. The car goes forward. I get to work on time. All kinds of things flow from that. I have a story about what keeps my car working, about how I have to live up to the service contract and make sure everything about it is running. Then one day I get in the car and I turn it over and nothing happens. And I'm going to be late for work, and it's a bad day to be late for work. And so you're usually in a state of some kind of at least surprise, if not trauma, by change that happens. And to move forward, we have to really start by calming down. We have to start by kind of going, okay, we need to move here, and we need to move it forward in a good way and keeping open and work on the anxiety reduction. So I would say step one is, how do we just get in touch with our heart rate, breathe deeply, and take that first step?
You know, I've seen the opposite as well, where there are people that are just wired for constant change, and in the lack of it, they actually get stressed out or bummed out or freaked. Have you experienced that as well?
Yeah, I'm curious about whether that's kind of looking for constant change, or or kind of finding that they have a real appetite for the new, and our brains love new things. Our brains love to do new, different things than we've done before. So I think some people have a better relationship to change than others, and they're probably more restless and need to find a way to accept what routine is. I don't know. Is that always a good idea? What do you think?
I don't know. It's a strange phenomenon, because I see people from both courts, and some of them, the repetition of a story becomes a very soothing and safe place to be, and it's like pulling hen's teeth to get them out of that story, even when it quits working. And others, it's like they'll change the story even when the change isn't necessarily for the better, just to avoid boredom. It's just a really interesting thing I see. Now, you mentioned that all memory is stored as story. Would you mind explaining that to our listeners?
Well, the idea is that memory is not a thing. Memory is a weaving together of different bits of information. So our memories are stored by rehearsal, not kind of by nature. A memory doesn't sort of sit in your head. We rehearse the story of what happened, and in that way, we lay down the track for that to be remembered. And the good news about that is that you can change the story. And I'm not saying that you can change a thing that happened to you. If a car hit you as you were stepping out of your yard one day and you broke your leg, you're not going to change that the car hit you. But what you can do is change how you tell the story of that incident and what happened. So if you've been telling the story of that incident in such a way that it's kind of creating limitations, by shifting the way you tell the story of what happened, you can actually begin to create new possibilities. It's part of the work of imagination, which is a powerful force.
So we can take what's happened to us and reframe how we respond to it. Say, for instance, you can either be a victim of that accident or you can find the humor in it. Is this kind of what we're looking at?
Yeah, you can find the humor in it. You can find the possibility and the meaning in it. You can find the injustice in it. You can still go forward in a bundle of fury about people driving more safely. You can find something creative to do with it, but you can change the way you situate yourself in it. You can change the role that you assign yourself in the story, as you say, and that creates the possibility for changing something about your life. So this is assuming that you're not enjoying the things that have resulted from the stories that you're telling yourself, that there's something that you wish to change in your universe, or maybe must change. Maybe the world is telling you that it's got to change because it's just not working the way that you wanted it to anymore.
So how do you help people recognize the stories they're living and the ones that don't work?
Well, we start by looking at all the stories. We start by inviting them to tell us how they came to think the way they do about things. And we invite people to start looking at the roles. The way we look at it is that, so a lot of people offer you parts in their movies. I'm offered the part of daughter, of sister, of aunt, of wife, of psychologist, I'm offered a lot of different roles. And some of them might not be roles that I want to take, but there are different pressures and ways of working to try to, seduce me into finding it to be an interesting role. And the more aware we are, the more conscious we are of all the different stories that we're participating in, all the different parts that we're playing in different scenarios, the more we can start to look at them and wonder if this is really how we want to move forward, to really, if these parts are really the parts that we want, or do we want to perhaps take a look at turning down some roles or shifting some roles or maybe creating some new ones. So we can work with the information that we are living by, and we're all performing stories. We're performing the stories we were born into. We're performing the stories that we've been trained into, and the stories that we've put together from our own observations of the world. And if you think about even a rule as a story, a rule of life is a story about how life works. So if my dog's rule of life is that when I come home in the evening, the first thing that we do is to feed her. And if she's not fed right away the first thing, she gets very uncomfortable. And she starts wondering what's going on and why the routine is unsettled. And, if I have a rule about how you treat people and somebody violates that rule, the rule is a story. The rule is a story that I've acquired by observation and information. And sometimes that information and observation might be a little wonky. And sometimes we might be working with rules that we invented or discovered or wrote for ourselves during times when we weren't necessarily fully conscious of what was going on. Sometimes we have in place rules that we formed when we were really little about how the world works that we haven't really taken out and examined since then. So the more we look at these stories of how we come to think the way we think, if we look at the stories, there's always a story. We don't find many people who have
I'm going to have to go ahead and take a break here, Barbara. I hate to interrupt. It's going to be fun to come back. We'll return to our discussion after this short break. You're listening to The Science of Magic. I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. If you want to hear more, other innovative episodes can always be found on our website, www.thescienceofmagic.net. The scientist and the mystic have been on an age-old, relentless search with one thing in common. They seek truth. Their paths converge in the 40,000-year-old practice of shamanism, an ancient science delving to the quantum level of life, facilitating healing, manifestation, and evolution. I'm Gwilda Wiyaka, the founder and director of Path Home Shamanic Arts School, a unique Colorado State certified occupational school training shamanic practitioners and teachers. We also provide classes for empowering personal lives through shamanism. Our certification classes are in week-long segments enabling international participation, and online classes and long-distance shamanic healing sessions are available. Come discover the science of magic in the limitless world of shamanism. www.findyourpathhome.com. Welcome back. This is the Science of Magic, a place where magic and science come together to promote enlightenment. We can be found on www.thescienceofmagic.net. I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. Our special guest this hour is psychotherapist and author Barbara Mainguy, M.A., co-author of Remapping Your Mind. Welcome back, Barbara.
Thank you.
After talking to you a little bit, and of course we know my background's in shamanism, I have to ask you, how's the concept in your book related to the indigenous ideas?
Well, the indigenous healers have known for centuries, maybe millennia, that stories can be used in healing. They've known this for a long time. This is not new information. And working with stories has been an important part of healing. We visited Australia, where they have a culture that dates back 30,000 years, and where they work with story, and they tell stories, and their stories are held as medicine by the tribes. So the idea of story isn't new. The idea of working with story isn't new. The so-called narrative movement that even began in Australia with Michael White began based in kind of Aboriginal ideas of healing. All that's happened is that as time has gone on and people have used these kinds of ideas, good old neuroscience has come along. And as one of the elders that we know said, isn't it great that neuroscience has finally caught up to the Lakota? And I think that's kind of how we look at it, that, we're just taking advantage of being able to talk to a different audience and say to them, look, this is really good stuff. This is a great way to reach people and to make connections and to really understand people and to help people.
Yeah, in my training, I come to understand that neurological relationships are built up in our minds through repetition, and these are the stories we're talking. But to change our lives, we have to change these neurological relationships, or we create these ruts that we keep doing the same old thing in the same old way, and yet expecting different results. You speak of the avatars in our mind. I find that very fascinating. What exactly is that?
Well, so an avatar is a storyteller. And now there's a Lakota idea called the Nahi. And in the Nahi, the idea is that we, the self, is kind of something that arises as a result, as a function of all the stories being told about us by all the storytellers telling them. So in this idea, we have ancestors and people who have already crossed over telling stories about us. We have all the stories that are told about us culturally and in our families and in our relationships. And somewhere in this kind of swarm, we emerge. The we, the self, the I emerges. So what we like to work with is this idea that a little bit of those storytellers is kind of becomes part of us. Those storytellers are represented in our minds. Now, other ways of thinking of psychology think of this idea that there's an internalized mother, there's an internalized father. What they call parts therapy talks about different, bits of yourself that might be speaking. And we just take that sort of same idea and run with it and say that there's spirits, there's beings, there's characters, there's all manner of of folks occupying your spiritual self, which I would argue is part of your whole self, and that by getting to know who's speaking, you can begin to kind of maybe reach a truce. Sometimes people find their minds to be incredibly noisy places, and sometimes what the task is, in some ways, is to try to find a way to create a little bit of peace in there, and to find some ways of negotiating a better, we call it the self-world interface. And one example that we've always enjoyed is a woman who is getting in trouble during rush hour with her driving habits, and we did some work with her, and she kind of worked out that the person behind the wheel was more or less her own internal Red Queen from Alice in Wonderland. And you remember the Red Queen really runs around saying off with her head all the time. So she's not really a great person to have driving the car during rush hour. And so by doing some kind of work of bringing this into consciousness, she was able to say that the Red Queen could no longer drive the car, that somebody else was going to drive the car, and the Red Queen had to sit in the back, so that whenever the Red Queen's voice started emerging while she was in traffic, she could say to the Red Queen, now you sit in the back seat and just shush up and let me get us home, and then later I'll hear from you about whose head you want to take off. And so what it does, so it just allows for some real flexibility of how you manage in the world. And I guess what I would say, too, is that it's a lot more user-friendly to work in this way than it is to start to feel ashamed of your behavior in a car, which doesn't really help anything. And by acknowledging the existence of these kind of energies, these forces, we get to acknowledge that we are kind of at a function of all these different, we're really affected by these different energies that come into our worlds. And it seems to be a way of working that invites people to get away from this idea of having to somehow cleanse an essential self to the point where you no longer have any bad habits. Rather, this says we're kind of living with the personas of our bad habits, and we need to keep negotiating with them and kind of come to a better arrangement. So it seems like it creates the greater possibilities than some of the other approaches to helping people change.
So it sounds like being coming to terms with our own schizophrenia, if you will, rather than trying to abolish different aspects of our personality. Barbara, would you please tell our listeners how to contact you and where they can find your book?
Yeah, our book is available on Amazon, and I believe on the Coyote Institute webpage, which is coyoteinstitute.us, that there's a link to Amazon. So if you go through our webpage, then we end up with a tiny donation, but any little bit helps. What we do is Coyote is a not-for-profit and a 501c3, and we're any money that we collect, we use to offset the cost of attending any of our workshops, so that we have a nobody gets turned away policy. So any money that we raise helps us to keep that policy going, so that anybody can come without having to worry about the financial cost of it. And we have a Coyote Institute Facebook page, which is where we try to post all the up-to-date information. And so that we can be easily found through that. My own email is artbarb@gmail.com, because I'm a creative arts therapist, which is how I get to have all these fascinating ways of working being considered within my scope of practice, which is a good way to go.
Yes, it is. It is, and that's a beautiful provision you're offering there. How do you see people? Their stories limiting them, and how do you break that up? And we have just a little bit time to look at that, but how do you see people's stories limiting them?
I think what happens is if you have a rule about how the world works, like the rule that no matter what I do, nothing works, no matter no matter how much I try to change things, my mother won't ever let me. No matter, if you have a rule like that, then you tend to perform within that story. You tend to
We're going to have to pick up on the rules on the other side of this break. We'll be back on the flip side of this short break. You're listening to The Science of Magic. Our theme song, One People, One Nation, is from the Winds of Time album by my musical group Starfire and can be found on the iTunes.com, cdbaby.com, Amazon.com, and my website, GwildaWiyaka.com. We'll be back on the flip side of this little... The really interesting guest we're having here today. I'm really excited to bring her back on the other side of the break. And the Coyote Institute sounds very fascinating. I'd suggest looking at her website and seeing what it looks like. Again, if you want to know more about shamanism, you can visit my website, www.gwildawiyaka.com, or you can visit the school website, www.findyourpathhome.com. Please hang in there. We'll see you on the short side of the break. The scientist and the mystic have been on an age-old, relentless search with one thing in common. They seek truth. Their paths converge in the 40,000-year-old practice of shamanism, an ancient science delving to the quantum level of life, facilitating healing, manifestation, and evolution. I'm Gwilda Wiyaka, the founder and director of Path Home Shamanic Arts School, a unique Colorado State certified occupational school training shamanic practitioners and teachers. We also provide classes for empowering personal lives through shamanism. Our certification classes are in week-long segments enabling international participation, and online classes and long-distance shamanic healing sessions are available. Come discover the science of magic in the limitless world of shamanism. www.findyourpathhome.com. Hello and welcome back. This is The Science of Magic, a place where magic and science come together to promote enlightenment. We can be found on www.thescienceofmagic.net. I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. Our special guest this hour is psychotherapist and author Barbara Mainguy, M.A., co-author of Remapping Your Mind. Barbara, we were getting into some really interesting stuff before we had to take a break. I've got a really good one for you here. So would you tell us about how you work with people who hear voices or see things that other people don't see?
Well, I would say it's more of the same, really. I mean, when you're working with somebody who hears voices, what you want to do is really help them to manage that internal experience. And often medication really just stops you caring so much about what the voices are saying. It doesn't actually do much to eliminate the voices. And so what we try to do is encourage people to negotiate with the voices, to encounter them, to get to know who they are, and then maybe to see if there might be, if they're negative voices, maybe to see if there might be some voices that have a little bit more of a positive spin, because often we find that some voices get heard more than others, and some voices have louder voices than others, and that it's very useful to look at recovering some of the quieter voices and some of the people who might be more useful to you on a day-to-day basis. And so that's really, how we work with it. We really work with people to sort out and we find that, when people hear voices, their inner life is very metaphorical. And so you really want to be able to go along with somebody's own internal metaphor. Because again, the story of how you are in the world is usually something that's been carefully and lovingly constructed over time. Stories are not just stories. Stories are deeply, richly rooted. They're like trees. I mean, they really grow into the landscape, and they've grown over years, and they've been planted carefully, again, to make us feel safe and like we know what's going to happen in the world. So when somebody needs to change a story, when a story's not working, it's shifting something that's very, very deeply rooted, not something that you can easily just pull up. A lot of the time. Sometimes, of course, there are stories that can be uprooted really quickly, like your quick changers that you were talking about before. But more often, I find people have a story that's really hard to walk away from because they've really prepared it. They've really lovingly adopted the story, and it's for some reason keeping them safe. So it's the same with people who hear voices. Often there's trauma. Often we're talking about something very traumatic that happened. And so there's a whole network of meaning of the world that has evolved from trying to manage this traumatic experience, perhaps without very much assistance. So it's like a thicket of thorns, a story that's formed a thicket of thorns around a person to be able to really help them to manage in a world, usually somebody pretty sensitive. And so what you're doing is trying to, first of all, make them feel that it's okay to trust you with that story. And if you are dismissive of a story, if you're derisive about a story, then somebody cannot trust you with their story, and they will, go away, and they won't be able to work with you because they won't be able to trust that you'll hear them without judgment. So we find that working without judgment, working with radical acceptance of the world that somebody's in, and joining them in that world and trying to see where there might be openings and spaces to renegotiate something is sort of how we start with that kind of work.
It's a fascinating process, and I know that when I'm working with people, I have this theory: you don't rock a boat until you see what makes it float. And so, in other words, you have to really get into a person's reality in order to see what's really working for them and what is not, and then gently lure them, like the hen luring the hunter into the woods, into a different framework. Then once they access this different framework, they always have the option, if they know, they always have the option to choose which framework they operate out of any given time. Just asking them to pause and make that choice starts to remap their mind or redirect the ruts in the mind so that they have more options. Is this the sort of thing that you're talking about, Barbara?
Absolutely. What you're doing is you're inviting them to practice something, to walk a little bit in this other framework, and then to have all the, create a sense of agency. When somebody knows that they can act and that they're choosing to act whichever way they go, and that they can act in accordance with these different frameworks, they start to discover the joy really of flexibility and the joy of imagination. And then you can get into the exciting work of helping somebody begin to imagine the future and the life that they'd really like to be living, and begin to use that incredible potent force of imagination. I think imagination can be weirdly underrated by people. I think they think it's just an artifact or something to be used when watching Disney or maybe writing a poem, but imagination is a very powerful energetic force. And I think that's the groundwork to lead into that. And I think you're right. You have to be really gentle with people, and you have to, lure them, as you say, into this other way of looking at things. And then absolutely, it is ultimately their actions that drive their life forward. They have to walk the walk. And so whichever walk they choose to walk, by acknowledging which road they're taking, by at least naming it and beginning to bring it into consciousness, they begin to develop choice. And then they can start to choose how to respond to something. Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it.
Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to be with us. We have a little bit of time here, and I'd like you to do you have anything you'd like to share, or any advice or support you would like to offer our listeners today?
I'd just like to say, it can be a beautiful thing to know your own stories and to begin to explore the power of your imagination in creating the world that you want to be a part of. And so I think everybody could start by writing some stories down about their life. And Lewis would always suggest that you write them in the third person, and if possible, turn everyone into animals. So over this holiday season, I invite people to write the story of their holiday, turning everyone into animals and writing in the third person, and see what new insights they can bring to their lives.
I love that idea, right? Turning people into animals. The animals might get insulted in some cases, though, I'm afraid. I've got a real difficult one for you in the time that we have left. Do you see these stories being used to program people? And if so, how can we avoid being victim of that?
Stories are powerfully hypnotic, and that's been known for a very long time. And the way we get around that is by really looking at everything as a story, by really saying this is a story, and by making sure we always compare and contrast to other stories that might be offered or other stories that we can imagine being true, and never getting locked into some kind of a truth about something. I think that's terribly important. And the forces that hypnotic power is certainly something that's used all over the place to convince people of things that are going on for political reasons, for commercial reasons. We're hypnotized every time we walk into a grocery store, into a department store. And I think it's vitally important to recognize that these are stories, that they're being created by somebody, that there's a storyteller, and to find out who that storyteller is, and to really take it upon ourselves to use our own discretion and discernment to decide when something is a story worth living to, and when one isn't.
Barbara, thank you so much for being with us. This has been The Science of Magic, and I'm your host, Gwilda Wiyaka. Remember, you can always listen to this and other thought-provoking episodes on our website from www.thescienceofmagic.net. From The Science of Magic and from the Exo Nation, we wish you all a very, very Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year, and may your stories be beautiful ones.